Good evening. It is good to see everyone this evening. Glad we did not get blown away through the afternoon, so here we are. We talked this morning about the topic of emotion. And briefly, I want to kind of get us to where we got to as far as our conclusion this morning, because tonight we're going to talk about some practical matters related to this idea of emotion. So we talked this morning first about the idea of what emotions are in the first place. When we're talking about emotion, at least for the purpose of our discussion, we're talking essentially about an instinctive mental response or reaction to something in the world around us. That could include, by the way, our own bodies and our own brain chemicals and all those kind of things, but it's some kind of reaction to some physical or circumstantial phenomena around us. So with that in mind, we ask the question then, are emotions a choice? And while we looked at several biblical examples and principles that do tell us we have a choice in terms of ways perhaps we can affect emotion, ways we can calm emotions, and certainly ways we can respond to our emotions after they occur, emotions themselves often are not chosen. They often arise as a reaction within our brains or whatever we want to describe it as, and therefore they themselves are not necessarily a choice, at least not at first. Now, once we have an emotional reaction, we can lean into that emotion, we can feed it and so forth, but the emotion itself, at least initially, can be very involuntary, certainly. But that does not mean, as we noted in our conclusion, that emotions are an excuse. The world will try and tell us that if something is not your choice, if something is beyond your control, well, then you are just at the mercy of everything that may bring about in the aftermath, if you will. That's the typical Disney saying, right? Follow your heart. Well, no, that is not what Scripture teaches at all. Our decisions, in fact, are not to be based primarily on emotion, even though emotions may play a part in different things, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But primarily, just because I have certain emotions relating to a certain thing, that does not excuse any choices I subsequently make. So now that we've had that kind of foundation placed for us in more of a big picture type of way, I want us to look this evening for a few minutes at this idea of how to handle emotions. Now, once again, I must give a caveat. I am not a counselor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an expert in terms of how to handle emotions when we start especially getting into things like clinical, personality disorders or depression or anxiety or anything like that. And that's not really the direction I'm trying to go. I'm trying to come at this from a very practical way, just in terms of everyday Christian life. We have emotions, believe it or not, as everyday Christians in different interactions and so forth. The question is not whether or not these situations are going to come up, but how do we handle them? How are some biblical ways to deal with emotions, whether they be positive emotions that we want to nurture and use in a positive way, or whether they be emotions that might present temptations for us as we move forward. There could probably be several principles that we could look at, but I've chosen 5 for us to examine tonight that I hope will be helpful. So first of all, as we're thinking about the idea of preparing, or rather of handling emotions, the first thing I want us to think about is the idea that we should prepare ahead of time. What do we mean by that? Ultimately, as we just said, it's no secret that I am going to have emotions arise within me in different times and situations. Now, if I know something is going to happen in the future, whether I know when and exactly what situation is going to happen in or not, I have an advantage, don't I? If I am about to go to war and I know what the enemy position is like and I know what kind of basic resistance that I'm going to face and so forth, well, I don't have an excuse if I don't prepare ahead of time for what I'm going to do. Let's say I'm a non-com or something like that and on the ground. I don't have any excuse for not preparing for that. Or let's say I am about to write a paper. Unfortunately, I have several of those coming up, right? I'm about to write a paper. Well, I know what the paper is going to be about. I've known it for a couple months now. So it's on me if, at least in the back of my mind, I haven't been mulling over different directions I want to go, different basic ideas I want to cover, figuring out at least what the topic is going to be, right, of these papers. We need to be preparing ahead of time if we know something that's coming that we have a responsibility to deal with. Well, the same thing is true with my emotions. For example, let's say I am someone, I don't feel like I am, but let's say for the sake of example, I'm someone who is very easily angered. Now, there are certain things that do make me very angry. I saw a picture of someone who put mayonnaise and peas on a pizza. That just makes me livid, I'm telling you. But let's just say, for example, that I'm someone who gets angry fairly easily, and I know that about myself. In the moment, as the anger begins to fester because of something that someone has done or some situation that I'm in, is that the time that I'm going to be most effective at dealing with that anger? Obviously not. I'm going to be much more effective at coming up with a plan if I know this is something I'm going to encounter. How am I going to deal with it? And then once I'm there, I have something in my mind. Okay, let me not say anything for 10 seconds. Let me walk in the other room for just a moment. Say, could you give me just a moment? I'm going to walk in the other room. Let me put a puzzle together. I don't know, whatever works for the individual. But there is something to be said for preparing ahead of time when we know we're going to have emotional reactions. And honestly, we're the ones who know ourselves, right? Hopefully. We have a responsibility then to do this. We see an example of this in Scripture in terms of the principle. Now, I know he's not talking about emotions specifically here, but the principle very directly applies. Know this, if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. This certainly applies, as Jesus is using it, to the idea of being ready when the Lord comes. But I want us to think about it in terms of anything in life. Let's even take it to a different place than what we're talking about or what Jesus is talking about. Let's talk about temptation. This is related because, after all, as we said, emotions can present a temptation to us. Let's say temptation. If I know that I struggle with drinking alcohol, should I be sitting at the bar in a restaurant that serves alcohol? Is there technically anything wrong, I'm talking big picture-wise, is there anything inherently wrong with sitting at that particular location if I don't ever drink or do anything like that? Not technically, but what am I doing, especially if I know that's a temptation for me? Well, I'm putting myself in a bad position. So maybe if someone asks to go out to eat, maybe even just being in the presence of a place that sells alcohol, that's going to bother me. Maybe I need to say, you know what, let's go to this restaurant that in the back of my mind I know doesn't serve alcohol, so that I'm preparing ahead of time not to put myself in that kind of temptation. And you could say that with all sorts of things, all sorts of situations we could put ourselves in. If I know ahead of time I'm going to put myself in a vulnerable situation, I'm going to put myself in a place of temptation, maybe I should do something about that before I'm in the moment, instead of just saying, oh, it'll be fine, and then lo and behold, it's not. Well, the same is true with our emotions. Our emotions can push us to do things that we shouldn't do. Our emotions can tempt us in ways that make it difficult in the moment for us to make the right decision, unless we have a plan and we have thought this through beforehand. Notice, but solid food is for the mature, is the Hebrews writer talking. For those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Remember this morning, Solomon said it's good to be slow to anger. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. It's good to be slow to anger. How do you think someone who is slow to anger got to that point? Now, I understand some people naturally, just by personality, are less likely to get angry or not get angry or whatever. But ultimately, as far as a character trait, a lot of that comes down to what they consistently choose, how they consistently respond. And that requires a degree of preparation. So the first thing I would say when we're talking about this idea of how to handle emotions is, if I wait to make a plan until my emotions are high, I'm much less likely to respond the way I know I should. And when we say making a plan, even just having this discussion this evening together like this, it puts it in our minds. It brings to the forefront, what are areas, what are ways, what are situations that I find myself less likely to respond the way I should because my emotions get in the way? Okay, well, if I know that on the front end, maybe that gives me a leg up to prepare as to how to deal with it when I'm in the moment. But let's look at another idea. This is very closely related, and that is we need to avoid emotion-based decisions. Now, I'm not saying that we should not have emotions at all when we are making a decision, nor am I saying that there aren't times where positive emotions can affect our decisions in a good sense. But man, when someone is very emotional, whether it is anger, whether it is sadness, whether it's excitement, whether it's all sorts of emotions we could put out there, right? How much does that affect our ability to think rationally? By definition, isn't thinking rationally and thinking emotionally, aren't those kind of opposites? And yet, if we're going to make a decision, while emotions are inherently good and are created as part of who we are as human beings, our decisions should not be based primarily on emotion. Again, we talked about that a little bit this morning. That's ultimately how, once again, the world tends to encourage us to make decisions. How many, I hate to go this route, but it's the truth, how many adulteries have been committed because people listened more to their emotions than to what they knew was right? How many people have very tragically, and I'm not placing blame here, I'm saying awareness is very important. How many people have, in great sadness, harmed themselves or even taken their own lives? That still was, in a sense, depending on the situation, a great emotional impact on that ultimate decision. And I, again, want to say, there are many cases of suicide where I would argue that the person has gone beyond being in control because of things they can't control in terms of brain and things like that. So I want to be very careful how we address that. But the point being, if we allow ourselves to be put in a decision-making role when our emotions are high, it's going to make things very, very difficult. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land? This is Israel. When emotions are high, after the 12 spies have come back, and 10 of them have given a very discouraging report. There's great fear. In fact, I would describe it more as panic among the camp of the Israelites. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land? Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Now, is it fair for them to have been a little fearful? Certainly, I would argue Joshua and Caleb showed the greatest character in not really showing any fear at all because they trusted in God. That would be the ideal. But is it sinful when we are encountering a legitimately frightening situation to at least initially feel a little fear? And yet, what did they do? Instead of figuring out how to deal with that fear, instead of taking a step back, instead of trying to let things settle so they could think clearly and make their decisions with a clear head, in the midst of their emotion, they decided to rebel. And we know what happened. Every single one of the people who said this died in the wilderness and did not get to go in the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb of this entire generation survived. All because, in part, they allowed their emotions to control their decision making. They allowed themselves to make a decision when they couldn't possibly have a clear head. Again, not in any way saying this is the only scenario something like this can happen, but certainly we see with Judas a decision, possibly one of the most tragic decisions a human being can make, influenced almost solely by his emotional response to having betrayed the Lord. We've talked about before, Judas is not the only one who betrayed the Lord that night. Peter did too. It was in two different ways, certainly. It was two different scenarios. But both betrayed Jesus. One of them, even though he was very upset about it, in fact, he went out and wept bitterly, he did not allow it to consume him to the point where he made a rash decision. Judas, on the other hand, chose to end his life when if he would have just waited, he would have seen the Lord again. Emotions were designed by God for many good purposes, but they tend to interfere with good decision making. Especially when we're talking about big decisions, but even with small decisions. If we sense that we are very caught up in our emotions, it is not the time to put ourselves in a decision-making position. In fact, I just had a conversation with someone the other day. Someone who was rightly outraged at a wrong someone else was doing, not even to him, but to another group of people. And he wanted to do something about it. He wanted to say something about it. But in that particular situation, there wasn't anything that would help the situation. It would only make matters worse if he were to interject himself into that situation. And so my encouragement, and I'm not saying I know all the answers in these kind of things, but my encouragement was, this isn't the time. Let a day or two pass, let your emotions settle, and then you'll be able to make a good decision about this. Number 3, speaking of time, use time to your advantage. What happens physically to our bodies when we feel strong emotions? Whatever those emotions are. Again, fear, anger, joy, excitement. What happens to our physical bodies? They start engaging in the emotion with us, for lack of a better term, don't they? When you're angry, literally you can start shaking. Your body tenses up. When you're joyful, you just are so excited and you almost want to jump up and down. Emotions at a high level, even just from a physical standpoint, they're not sustainable for very long, are they? They're exhausting. Whether they're positive or negative, they're exhausting. So you know what that means. If you just take some time, your emotions will fizzle out, at least to a degree, because that's just the way our bodies were made. And that can be an advantage. And we should use that advantage to our advantage. Going back to Proverbs, to Solomon's advice. A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. We didn't really talk about this aspect of being slow to anger when we mentioned being slow to anger this morning, but now I want to look at that phrase itself. Slow to anger. What does that imply? It implies the idea of allowing time to do its work. Literally, when we think about, especially in the New Testament, the idea of God being long-suffering, you might have heard before that word literally is essentially the idea of a long fuse. The idea that it's going to take a long time for this to actually cause any kind of major reaction, any kind of major response. I was even just talking to Keith a second ago about in a courtroom setting. What happens if you get people who can't control their anger? Well, for one thing, they give up control of themselves, and whoever else is functioning in the courtroom can take advantage of that. So what do you have here? You have this idea that time has a major effect on our emotions. He who is slow to anger quiets contention. You allow that emotion to run its course. You allow it to fizzle out. And all of a sudden, you don't have nearly the same level of conflict that you did before in many cases. There is a big difference between someone's angry at me, I respond angrily back, well, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to keep escalating, obviously. Well, what if they respond angrily and I don't? Well, that goes back to another statement of Solomon, right? A soft answer turns away wrath. Why? Because we're not feeding it. There's that, I think I've used this quote before, but there's that thing about the two wolves in a person, right? And whichever one you feed is the one that will control you. Well, there's kind of a similar thing with emotion. An emotion can only last as long as it's being fed. So if I allow it time to starve out, well, there you go. Genesis provides us a very interesting example of this. We know the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob, for all of his good qualities and the fact that he literally became the father of Israel, meaning the nation of Israel, he was not exactly a good person, certainly not in his early life. However, we might want to be favorably inclined towards him. He wronged his brother Esau on so many levels. Now, Esau contributed to this as well, don't get me wrong. Esau treated what he was cheated out of as worthless, we're told, especially in the New Testament. But that doesn't change the fact that Jacob still took advantage of him. That Jacob still cheated him even more than Esau realized at the time. And we remember what Esau said whenever Jacob had done this to him. The final straw, at least, which was taking his father's blessing. Esau said, I'm going to wait until my father passes on, and then I'm going to kill my brother. He had every right to be angry. This wasn't undue anger. He didn't have every right to kill him. But he had every right to respond with that emotion. What happened? Jacob leaves, fleeing for his life. He goes to stay with relatives. Years pass. In fact, at least a decade and a half pass. Eventually, Jacob comes back to his homeland. Esau is still in the area. And so Jacob is afraid, as would be natural, because he knows he has wronged his brother. And he also remembers his brother's anger. And so Jacob takes all of these precautions. He sends gifts to Esau and then sends more gifts to Esau as Esau gets closer and closer and closer. And finally, he meets Esau and he speaks very humbly to him. And remember how Esau responded? He didn't bring up the past. He wasn't seething in anger. He didn't take one look at Jacob and tell his men to kill him. He ran to his brother and embraced him and kissed him. And they wept together. Why? Part of that we can ascribe to Esau's character, it seems, in being someone who recognized that holding a grudge wasn't worth it. I would argue part of this we can also ascribe to the effects of time. I'm not suggesting if someone has something against you, leave for 2 decades, by the way. I am suggesting some degree of separation, some degree of allowing the feelings to dissipate, allowing time for wounds to mend to a degree. That can have a huge effect. And we see that in the story of Jacob and Esau. Time has a wonderful way of letting emotion subside if I will allow it to do its work. Now, I will make the comment, that does not mean we should take the attitude of, oh, I've wronged this person, let me give them time to settle down. No, my first response should be to apologize, to repent, and make things right. But when we have emotions that arise, sometimes when no one's really in the right or wrong, people just one way or another clash with one another. That happens, personalities and whatnot. Sometimes we just need to take advantage of the power of time. Fourthly, this one is very important. I think especially, I'm speaking to the guys, not more than the ladies, but I think we have harder time with this one. And that is process. Don't suppress. The stereotype for men and women is that women tend to be much more expressive emotionally and more emotional in general. I'm not going to go into whether that's an accurate stereotype or not, but I do think because of the stereotypes surrounding men and women, a lot of men feel like they're supposed to be the opposite. If women have the reputation of being very expressive emotionally, men aren't supposed to be expressive at all. Men aren't supposed to show emotion. Men aren't supposed to do any of those things. Now, I could do a whole lesson, and we probably will at some point, about the fact that that's simply not biblical. But specifically, when we're talking about handling emotion, let me put this out there. Everyone has emotions. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Doesn't matter if you're old or young. Doesn't matter if you're this personality type or that personality type. It may vary in terms of what it looks like, but everyone has emotions. The question is what you do with them, which is what we're talking about tonight. And the worst thing you can do, anybody, but guys tend to be more guilty of this, is to suppress your emotions. Now, I'm not suggesting that the alternative is to release your emotions and just not hold them back or control them in any way. That's exactly what we talked about this morning, right? Emotion is an excuse. But that seems to be the either-or statement that society gives us, especially for masculinity, if you will. Either you just vent your anger, vent your frustration, vent your whatever on everyone around you, or you just bottle it up inside, maybe because you think you're doing the right thing, to be fair, so that you don't hurt someone or be rude to someone or something like that because you are angry. But neither of those is actually the right solution. Suppressing, actually, in the long run, will do just as much damage as venting your emotions freely without any control. What needs to happen, and this is for everyone, is to process those emotions. And I think we see a very clear example of that. I want you to think about the scenario in which this verse occurs. What has just happened when Jesus wept? Well, Lazarus has been sick. He has heard about what has been happening with Lazarus, Jesus has, and he stays away, knowing, of course, what's going to happen. Lazarus dies. Then Jesus goes to be with the family, and ultimately, he knows to heal Lazarus, meaning to resurrect him from the dead in this case. But in the process, as he sees everyone around him mourning Lazarus' death, Jesus weeps. Was this a shameful expression of weakness on Jesus' part? No. Was this even appropriate? Because he knows he's just about to raise the man from the dead. Now we could speculate, perhaps he's weeping in part because he doesn't want to have to bring Lazarus back to the world. Lazarus is now past all of the suffering of this world, and he's about to bring him back. Maybe that's part of it, but I think the indication of the text is, at least in large part, he is weeping because he sees how this has affected those around him. And he is processing the emotional response that he, as a human being, God as well, of course, but also as a human being, is processing the emotions that brings up within him. He's not bottling it up. He's not unleashing it without control. He is processing it. I have seen people, I'm sure you probably have too, whenever something bad happens, they refuse to acknowledge it. They refuse to talk about it. They refuse in any way to allow it to be processed in their minds. You know what that does? That hurts them. I'm not saying we all have to grieve the same way. I'm not saying we all have to process emotion the same way. I'm saying we have to process it some way. And if we don't, it's not only going to hurt us, but it's going to hurt those around us. There's a reason why Paul tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice, to weep with those who weep. You realize that both of those words ultimately are emotional words? We are not only to support those in a practical sense that are going through strong emotional responses to difficult situations, we are supposed to share not just in the practical side, but in the emotional side with them. That's part of our duty as Christians. And if we don't allow ourselves to process all the emotions that come with that, if we bottle them up, we already said we don't need to just unleash them and have no control. But if we bottle them up, number one, it's going to create a lot of unhealthy ways of coping for us. Number two, it's going to make it harder for us to empathize and relate to and follow Paul's commands about how to relate to the people around us. And number three, what happens when you bottle something up and it builds in pressure? Eventually it explodes. And that's not good either. If I make a habit of ignoring or denying emotions rather than understanding and dealing with them, there's no way to sugarcoat this. Whether we see it or not, people will get hurt. People will get hurt. So the responsibility is on us. This is part of dealing with our emotions, is learning how to process them in a healthy way, not just bottling them up in a way that ultimately is going to cause just as much, if not more, harm than if we let them run rampant. Either extreme is not helpful. But lastly, as we think about how to handle emotions, harness emotions for good works. As we said toward the beginning, God created emotion. I know a lot of what we've been talking about is, well, this emotion can be a temptation, this emotion can push me to do something I shouldn't do. I understand that, and that's very valid. But God created emotions for a reason. Emotions are not a mistake. Emotions, if acted on and responded to in a healthy way, they are a very positive thing. Even what we might call negative emotions sometimes can still be used in a positive way. If someone does something horrible to another person, anger may be a negative emotion, but isn't it appropriate in that situation? How we respond to it is still a choice and still needs to be a sound choice. But we have descriptions of both God while he was on earth as Christ, but also God even in heaven. Maybe this is using human language, but still being angry. At the same time, we see the idea of positive emotions being used for good works. Emotions, if used correctly, and if processed correctly also, as we talked about a moment ago, can be very effective in helping us, in being a catalyst for us to do what God wants us to do. Think about prodigal son. He arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Now I know on the one hand, the father in this parable represents God. On the other hand, this is meant to be a model to the Pharisees. If you look at the context of the parable, they should be responding the same way the father responds in the parable. He felt compassion. There are a lot of emotions I think I would feel. Certainly, I can't accurately imagine exactly what it would be like to be in this father's shoes. There are a lot of emotions I think I would feel. Frustration, anger, disgust. But I would hope that I would process those emotions and recognize that the emotion I should be harnessing, the emotion that I should be feeding when I see my son appear over the horizon, coming back home, would be compassion. And that compassion will push me to do what I've already decided is the right thing to do. And that is to welcome him home. As it is, I rejoice. This is an interesting example because it's kind of the opposite. I rejoice not because you were grieved, Paul writing to Corinth, but because you were grieved into repenting, for you felt a godly grief. There are two kinds of, I would describe this really as guilt. There's one kind where we afflict ourselves over something that has been righted, that has been repented of, that we moved on from, but we still punish ourselves with guilt. That's not a healthy form of guilt. That's not a healthy way to process guilt, even if the initial feeling of guilt was valid because maybe we did actually do something wrong. But there's another kind of guilt, which I would argue is also an emotion. And that's the guilt that Paul describes here. A guilt that when I do initially realize I've done wrong, I allow the feeling that brings up, that is not a pleasant feeling, as we all can attest, I'm sure. I allow that feeling to push me to do the right thing. That's healthy. We could go on and on about different ways that this principle is true. If I allow myself to experience the sadness of a loss, I can harness that emotion as I help others to cope with loss. If I allow myself to fully experience the joy of something wonderful happening in life, that will allow me to rejoice with those who experience that same joy. If I allow myself to, in a controlled way, be outraged with righteous indignation at something wrong that is done, that can help me to protect the innocent. And on and on and on and on we could go. The point is, my emotions can greatly enhance my efforts to do good, as long as both the effort, which is ultimately a choice, and the emotion, as long as those are both in their proper place. The problem comes when we flip them and we allow the emotion to dictate the choice. So, the bottom line that I want us to leave with this evening, if I'm intentional in the way that I respond to my emotions, I can make them my allies, not my enemies. But that takes focus. That takes preparation. That takes intentionality. If I just allow my emotions to do whatever they're going to do, number one, that's not self-control, which is something we are called to develop. But number two, I'm squandering a wonderful resource God has given me. I want emotion as an ally, not as an enemy. But that means I have a responsibility in how I handle these emotions as they arise. I hope this is helpful to us. I hope this is practical for us, because this is something that is universal for all of us, not confined to any single one or one group of us. We all have to deal with these things, which means we all have a responsibility of how we deal with these things. If there's anything we can help you with this evening, we always stand ready. Please let us know what we can do as we stand and sing.